Well, thank you very much, Jason, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to Natalie and to Chris and to all of those who have organized this event tonight. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming. Let me begin with the posh British soap opera, Downton Abbey. I have a love-hate relationship with this program, but I will no doubt go and see the movie version, which is coming out in September. Yes. For those of you who, like me, watched all 6 seasons, in spite of your better instincts, you will remember the handsome, nay gorgeous, Thomas Barrow, variously footman, valet, and under-butler. Thomas is an invert, a homosexual, a queer, to use some of the terms available at the time. This was when gay sex was illegal and sexual deviants were little understood and widely despised. Thomas's opportunities for sex and love are very limited and clandestine, and he's always threatened by exposure and blackmail. All of which explains why he's really, to use the British vernacular, quite a miserable bugger. Both the writer, Julian Fellowes, and the actor, Robert James Collier, have said that Thomas's scheming and plain nastiness can be traced directly back to how being a sexual outcast has warped his personality. Thomas is such an unhappy homosexual that he resorts to quack patent medicines in an attempt to cure himself and turn straight. These make him very ill, and of course, they don't work. One of the questions I want to address today is how Western society shifted over the course of less than a century from this state of affairs to giving full and equal rights to gays and lesbians, including gay marriage. Put another way, I want to ask how we can make Thomas happy and less evil by letting him freely love another man, in this case, Jimmy, a fellow servant. Pivotal to my story this evening are the 2 events whose half-century we are celebrating this year: the decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada and the Stonewall riots in the United States. Let me begin with the ancient Greeks. This is going to be a very long evening. I do hope you don't have a train to catch. Okay, let me be a little more reasonable because I have only a short amount of time, and I'll begin instead with the middle decades of the 20th century. Thomas was unsuccessfully wrestling with his sexual orientation in the 1920s. This was in the midst of a prolonged period from the late 19th century to the 1950s, during which a lot of scientific, medical, and even progressive religious opinion was giving up on the notion that same-sex acts were sinful, depraved, unnatural, and immoral, which had been the working assumption for centuries, and moving instead towards the medicalization of sexuality. The belief that deviant sexuality was A, pathological, a form of physical or mental disease, or B, an inborn harmless variation shared by a tiny third sex. This was the view, for example, of early 20th century English sexologist Havelock Ellis and German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. Or C, the Freudian version, a relatively harmless form of arrested development. The child got stuck, got fixated at a primitive stage of psychic evolution and failed to reach a heterosexual object choice, and that might or might not respond to psychotherapy. Or D, the version proposed by American sexologist Alfred Kinsey, that sexual variety was normal and natural in humans, just as in the rest of the animal kingdom. Kinsey was publishing his books in the late 1940s and early 1950s. In other words, just after the Second World War, which had opened up a much greater public space for gays and lesbians in terms of bars, clubs, and so on, in cities like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. This period saw increased gay rights activism as well. There had been homosexual rights movements in Europe before the Second World War, the most prominent associated with Magnus Hirschfeld in the permissive environment of Berlin in the 1920s. But that was shut down by Hitler and the Nazis in 1933. And only one homophile organization, Der Kreis, the Circle, in Switzerland, survived the war. But several more were established in the late 1940s and 1950s. You see this in Denmark, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Britain, and in the United States, where the Mattachine Society for male homosexuals was founded in Los Angeles in 1950, and the Daughters of Bilitis for lesbians was founded in San Francisco in 1956. And these are their publications: Mattachine Review for the Mattachine Society, The Ladder for the Daughters of Bilitis. This greater visibility of perverts, combined with some of Kinsey's more alarming findings, for example, that 37% of American males had had a homosexual encounter to the point of orgasm, helped fuel a backlash. A key figure in the United States was Senator Joseph McCarthy, who thought that the government was riddled with homosexuals who could easily be blackmailed by communists. As a consequence, the government began a purge of gays and lesbians from all federal jobs. Purges took place in Canada as well. A vicious campaign in the 1950s and 1960s to eliminate all homosexuals from the civil service, the RCMP, and the military. For a few years in the 1960s, the authorities made use of what was nicknamed the fruit machine. This was something like a dentist's chair with a camera focusing on the pupil of the eye and a projector showing a range of pictures from the mundane to sexually explicit photos of men and women. The machine measured the diameter of the pupils plus perspiration and pulse, all of which was supposed to determine if the individual was turned on by same-sex images and was therefore homosexual and should therefore lose his job. There is an excellent and rather harrowing recent documentary about this disgraceful episode in Canadian history. It's called The Fruit Machine. Came out last year by filmmaker Sarah Fody. It aired on TVO and is available online, so I strongly recommend it. In the United States, in Canada, and in Britain in these years, it was possible for gays and lesbians to live discrete lives together, or to be part of discrete subcultures, but there was always the danger of getting on the wrong side of the law. And so, either encouraged or mandated by the courts, or from their own volition, many homosexuals sought treatment for their condition so that they could be cured, just like Thomas from Downton Abbey. These forms of treatment included psychotherapy, or chemical or hormonal treatments to correct the supposed imbalances that made people gay, or aversion therapy, or electric shocks. As we were reminded by the Benedict Cumberbatch film The Imitation Game, the most famous victim of this pseudoscience in Britain was Alan Turing, the great mathematician and inventor of the modern computer, who was the chief mind behind the breaking of Germany's Enigma code during the Second World War. Turing was gay, and while a professor in Manchester in the early 1950s, he was prosecuted for having gay sex. To avoid prison, he was ordered to undergo hormone treatment, estrogen injections, which caused bodily changes such as the development of breasts. A little while after the end of the treatment, in 1954, he killed himself. But amidst the miseries of the 1950s, there was some hope, principally in the shape of the Wolfenden Report of 1957, which was instrumental in bringing about reform both in Britain and in Canada. The report was the work of the Departmental Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, set up by Winston Churchill's Conservative government in 1954 and chaired by a university vice-chancellor, Sir John Wolfenden. It was partly a response to the changing intellectual opinion that had been generated by the sexologists, compounded by an increasing openness to the discussion of matters of sex in the press. But it was also part of a moral panic about homosexuality, sparked by a six-fold increase in prosecutions for homosexual offences, buggery, attempted buggery, and gross indecency in the previous 25 years. And this culminated in the trial and conviction in 1954 of two upper-class landowners, Lord Montague of Beaulieu and Michael Pitt Rivers, and a journalist for the Daily Mail newspaper, Peter Wildblood, purely for having consensual adult sex in private. The Wolfenden Committee heard from more than 200 witnesses. This is shameless self-promotion, but as Jason said, I happen to have written about this, so please go out and buy a copy, starving author and all of that, and I'll be happy to sign it for no extra charge. 3 of the witnesses were self-declared homosexuals. All 3 were masculine-presenting, well-educated, professional, well-connected, genuine inverts, to use the phrase of the time. In other words, they were identical to the male members of the Wolfenden Committee in all aspects except for their sexual orientation. One of these men was Carl Winter. He was the Australian-born director of the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge. As he eloquently pointed out to the committee, many homosexual men had reached the highest offices in church and state and received the honours and rewards of a grateful nation, but they could be imprisoned and their reputations and careers ruined if the law discovered that they had departed, quote, from a rule of total chastity that it demands of no other body of citizens. Let the homosexual be in every other respect the ablest, most honourable and trustworthy of human beings. He is to be totally disabled and untrusted in the one single matter which of all others is to all of us our most private concern. The final report of 1957 concluded that there was no single cause of homosexuality and that homosexuality was not a disease, an illness, or a pathology. Its principal recommendation was, quote, that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offense. It advocated a strict private-public distinction that would have been familiar to any reader of On Liberty by the great Victorian liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill. As the report put it, unless a deliberate attempt is to be made by society, acting through the agency of the law, to equate the sphere of crime with that of sin, there must remain a realm of private morality and immorality which is, in brief and crude terms, not the law's business. In other words, it was the law's job to preserve public order and decency, not to police morals. As Pierre Elliott Trudeau was later to summarize this stance in this country, there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. But the Wolfenden report made quite clear the limits of toleration. It did not intend in any way, quote, to condone or encourage private immorality. And there should be no relaxation in the policing of public misconduct, such as homosexual importuning. It is important that the limited modification of the law which we propose should not be interpreted as an indication that the law can be indifferent to other forms of homosexual behavior, or as a general license to adult homosexuals to behave as they please. So the message was clear. A certain type of domesticated, discreet, respectable homosexuality was tolerable, but public displays, queer sociability in pubs and clubs, flamboyance, male prostitution, and promiscuity were not. So this was progress of a sort. But fearing public hostility, neither the Conservative government nor the opposition Labour Party supported reform. It took another decade of concerted lobbying by the Homosexual Law Reform Society, set up in 1958, pressure from more progressive members of Parliament in the somewhat more liberal environment of the 1960s, and the support of a reform-minded Labour Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, for the Sexual Offences Act to pass in 1967 on largely Wolfendenian lines. 2, but only 2, men over the age of 21, so long as they were not in the armed forces or the merchant navy, could now legally have sex together, so long as it was in private. And that was narrowly interpreted. Saunas, bathhouses, and back rooms, for example, were not considered private. Now, in Canada, there was a similar combination of bottom-up and top-down pressure for change. From the bottom up, homophile organizations such as the Association for Social Knowledge in Vancouver and activists working through the liberal churches, beginning with the Unitarians and the Quakers, plus some elements of the media and the legal profession, drew heavily on Wolfenden to make a claim for a legal private space for homosexuals, and in some cases pushed beyond it to argue for a lower age of consent. One NDP MP, Arnold Peters, even moved a Wolfenden-inspired private members' bill in 1964. It got nowhere, but it was the first time the issue had been raised in the federal parliament. From the top down, Wolfenden was seen as a useful means of containment. Thus far and no further. In the 60s context of rising feminist demands, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the black civil rights struggle, a limited reform based on a clear public-private distinction seemed an increasingly sensible holding operation against a radical tide. Things came to a head in 1967, partly because of the Sexual Offences Act in Britain, partly because of a Supreme Court decision in the case of Everett George Clippert. Clippert, who had been raised in Calgary, had been convicted on 18 charges of gross indecency in 1960 and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was arrested again in 1965 and admitted 4 further counts of gross indecency. A psychiatrist at his trial testified that he was incurably homosexual, and so the court sentenced him to preventive detention, i.e. indefinitely, as a dangerous sexual offender, just for having oral sex with other men. On appeal, the Supreme Court upheld this decision in November of 1967. Any notion that it didn't really matter if homosexuality remained criminalized because it was rarely policed for consenting adults, that it was better to leave the legislation intact so as to discourage the spread of this vice, now collapsed. The day after the Supreme Court decision, NDP leader Tommy Douglas invoked Clippert's name in the House of Commons in arguing for decriminalization. 6 weeks later, mindful of Wolfenden, the Clippert case, and the distance that had now opened up between Canada and Britain, Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau included homosexuality alongside abortion, contraception, gun possession, drink driving, and much else besides in his omnibus bill C-195. This bill re-emerged as Bill C-150 the following year, while Trudeau was Prime Minister and John Turner was the Justice Minister. It passed its third reading on the 14th of May 1969 by a vote of 149 Liberals, NDPers, and some progressive Conservatives to 55. Most of the progressive Conservatives, the Créditistes from Quebec, and one sole Liberal. This omnibus bill, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, received its royal assent on the 27th of June 1969. This was all well and good, but it wasn't gay liberation. The language of the debates in the parliaments on both sides of the Atlantic had been steeped in notions of sickness, perversion, and moral corruption. The stigma against homosexuality remained. Arrests for homosexual offences actually increased after decriminalization as the authorities rigorously policed the now more sharply defined public space. And it was still quite legal to discriminate against men and women because of their sexual orientation. Wolfenden and partial decriminalization may have eased open the door, ultimately enabling access to a much greater gay presence and visibility than the framers of the legislation ever intended. But gay liberation was to come from gays and lesbians themselves. It dates its immediate origins to the 27th of June 1969, ironically and coincidentally, the very same day that the Omnibus Act passed the Royal Assent in Canada. It was on this day that the police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. The Stonewall was a mafia-controlled dive. It was owned by members of the Genovese crime family who displayed an ill-concealed contempt for the faggots who provided them with a lucrative income from their overpriced, watered-down drinks. But it was also the most popular gay bar in the city because it was the only one with a dance floor. It attracted a diverse clientele of mainly young men, black, white, Puerto Rican, Asian, effeminate flamers, leather-clad hustlers and drag queens, plus chicken hawks looking to pick up street kids. It had no liquor license, so it operated as a members-only bottle club, with patrons signing themselves in using names like Judy Garland, Elizabeth Taylor, and Donald Duck. The police allowed it to continue operating because they were regularly paid off. Even so, for form's sake and to ensure the continued flow of bribes, about once a month the police raided it, briefly arresting staff, patrons without IDs, and anyone who was wearing attire deemed not to match their gender, contrary to a city bylaw, and the police confiscated any liquor that they found. The bar had ways of hiding its liquor, so it usually reopened later the same evening. So there's this kind of ritual which was played out on a regular basis. The raid on the evening of the 27th, or more accurately in the early hours of the 28th, it was after 1 a.m. in the morning, was different. It was unannounced, it was much later in the night than usual, and it was possibly inspired by federal agents cracking down on bootlegged booze. The gays had fought back a handful of times before, famously at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco in 1966 when trans patrons resisted arrest. But usually the police could rely upon them being quite docile. But in the midsummer heat of Greenwich Village, this time the reaction was different. There is a story that people were emotionally overwrought because of the funeral earlier that day of gay icon Judy Garland. It's a nice story, it's probably a myth. Whatever the combination of factors, and certainly primed by the increasing crescendo of minority rights activism against state repression and police violence in the late 60s, the crowd began to boil. And things quickly escalated into a full-scale riot, with the police barricaded into the Stonewall Inn before they were rescued by a riot squad. Accounts vary, but most suggest that butch lesbian Stormé Delavery, black drag queen Marsha P. Johnson, and Puerto Rican drag queen trans activist Sylvia Rivera played prominent roles. This was, as Dick Leach, a leader of Mattachine, wrote, the hairpin drop heard round the world, the prelude to a revolution. The rioting was repeated for several nights. Within weeks, gays and lesbians in New York had formed the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF. And that spawned imitators elsewhere, such as in London and in Montreal. In Montreal, it was the Front de Libération Homosexuelle. The GLF rejected what they saw as the apologetic liberalism of the homophile reform organizations like Mattachine. These organizations had done good brave, important work, usually in hostile environments and with little sympathy from the general public. But their time was over. The gay liberationists stood instead proudly for gay power, under the slogans, "Gay is good, coming out is good." They rejected the repressive institutions of heteronormativity, such as the family, the schools, the law, the churches, the media, and the psychiatrists. We are a revolutionary homosexual group of men and women formed with the realization that complete sexual liberation for all people cannot come about unless existing social institutions are abolished. They demanded nothing less than the demolition of what they saw as the artificial categories of heterosexual and homosexual, and the oppressive gender roles of masculine and feminine. Gay lib mirrored women's lib, which also powerfully rejected conventional female gender roles and sexual norms, coming to see marriage, the family, and motherhood as institutions maintaining the oppression of women, and crusaded against all forms of male dominance and gender discrimination. Many lesbians were attracted to the cause of women's emancipation. It was a logical extension for some to suggest that if male domination and power were the problem, then heterosexuality was the problem. That heterosexuality wasn't natural, but an ideology and an institution to keep women bound to men, and therefore to block their struggle for full liberation. The solution was to embrace lesbianism as a form of political rebellion. But the wilder dreams of liberation did not materialize. The revolutionary potential quickly ran out of steam as the more militant gay and women's lib movements soon split over ideas and tactics. By the mid-1970s, the gay movement had largely given up on trying to explode categories and orientations and had tended to coalesce around identity politics, the notion that there were fixed sexual orientations, straight, gay, and maybe bisexual. The idea of a fixed gay identity was very helpful in allowing a base, a constituency for gay activists to mobilize in pursuit of gay civil rights. In other words, gay activism became more reformist than revolutionary. The battle for rights since the 1970s has been long and hard, particularly with the enormity of the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s and 90s. Without the heroic energy, grassroots organization, and militancy of gay rights activists, without the resistance to police oppression, the pushback, for example, against the police raids of the Trucks Bar in 1977 and Sex Garage in 1990 in Montreal, without the annual Pride parades, without the individual acts of bravery in coming out and standing proud, very little would have been accomplished. The metaphorical unfurling of the rainbow flag, the radiation of gay liberationist zeal from Stonewall onwards, is a vital part of the story, even if the dream of revolutionary overthrow was never realized. But other factors were at play as well in the slog towards gay equality. One was the greater liberalization of ideas towards sex in general, gradually and generationally diffused through the population since the 1960s, intimately associated with the collapse of organized religion and of a shared national secular morality. Another was the fact that as more and more gays and lesbians came out in the newly legitimized and increasingly liberal environment, the straight population had to recognize and to deal with the fact that the puffs and the perverts were family members, friends, and colleagues. Another was the greater visibility of prominent queer television personalities, actors, politicians, and other public figures. Another was the championing of gay civil rights legislation by, for example, the Parti Québécois government of René Lévesque after 1976, or the new Labour government of Tony Blair from 1997, even when, initially at least, it was not a popular or vote-winning cause. And yet another is because of the amorality of capitalism. Big and small business came to realize that there was money to be made from the pink dollar and the pink pound, both in cultivating queer consumers and increasingly in branding one's enterprise as tolerant, inclusive, and progressive. It turned out that gay and lesbian rights were perfectly compatible with corporate capitalism and with neoliberalism. All this helps explain the quiet revolution in gay rights over the last 50 years, epitomized by the full legalization of gay marriage in Canada, 2005, in Britain in 2014, and in the United States in 2015. The contrast is stunning between the cautious and pitying language of the debates in the Ottawa Parliament in 1969 and the 28th of November 2017, when an emotional Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and said, "Canada gets a little bit stronger every day that we choose to embrace and to celebrate who we are in all our uniqueness. We are a diverse nation, and we are enriched by the lives, experiences, and contributions of people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit. To the trailblazers who have lived and struggled, and to those who have fought so hard to get us to this place, thank you for your courage, and thank you for lending your voices. I hope you look back on all you have done with pride. For the oppression of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit communities, we apologize. On behalf of the government, Parliament, and the people of Canada, we were wrong. We are sorry, and we will never let this happen again." It would give a nice, satisfying sense of closure to leave the story there. Full legislative equality. Maybe Thomas Barrow could now be happy and a bit less of a miserable bugger. What more could we possibly want? But of course we can't leave it there. The world has been made safe for queers like me. White, respectable, more or less, cisgendered, with all those immense privileges of skin color, gender, class, and education, happily married, my husband is in the front row here, happily tenured in an accommodating university, it's important, in a queer-friendly city, in a tolerant country. I am, in many ways, a modern incarnation of Carl Winter, though obviously not quite as dapper. Wolfenden, in other words, had someone like me in mind when he made his recommendations. This sense of the quiet triumph of Wolfenden the mainstreaming of the queers, as much as or more than the queering of the mainstream, our incorporation into heteronormative institutions, was perhaps given its best expression by British Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron when he said, "Conservatives believe in the ties that bind us. Society is stronger when we make vows to each other and we support each other. I don't support gay marriage in spite of being a conservative. I support gay marriage because I am a conservative." So we can't just leave it at that with me and Thomas happy. The Gay Liberation Front did not have us and only us in mind. For a start, we cannot assume that progress is perpetual. History does not have a telos. It doesn't have a willful mind, a direction, a goal, a conclusion. Progress can go into reverse, just as orange can replace black in the White House, or ethnic nationalism is upending cosmopolitanism in Europe. Eternal vigilance to maintain the gains we have won is essential. And more than that, it is still formidably difficult for sexual minorities to come out, even in tolerant Canada, particularly in small-town or rural or faith-based communities. Bullying and queer bashing are still rife in schools. It is still almost impossible to come out in major league sports. Quacks still peddle conversion cures or organize camps to pray away the gay. The toll of mental health problems, addictions, and suicides, or attempted, contemplated suicides, especially for LGBTQ youth, is still horrendous. Trans people and queer people of color suffer from additional intersectional discrimination. The trans community has made considerable strides forward in recent years, but the road to full acceptance will be long and arduous. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that there are still huge swaths of the world where sexual or gender nonconformity is barely possible. All of which is to say that there is plenty of work to be done in the next half-century. Aux âmes citoyens et citoyennes, the gay revolution continues. Thank you all for listening.